Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be reviewing, building, and talking a little bit about MDF terrain. Now, if you're a fan of gaming and a fan of having a big, full table with lots of terrain on it, you've definitely come across this stuff, whether in your local game shop or online, and I'm sure many of you have considered whether or not it's worth a purchase. Looking at it comparatively to other similar products, it's incredibly cheap. It's almost hard to believe how much of this you could get for the same price as something else. And that makes it appeal to a lot of people. It also seems to be a fairly divisive product. Very few things out there have as many people who absolutely hate it, and as many people who completely swear by it. So we're going to dig into all of that a little bit as we put this together and give a review. Let's get started. This particular kit is made by Sarissa Precision. It's from their Gangs of Rome line and is called the Upper Rank Shop Block. It's going to be helping to fill out the fantasy Roman city that my next campaign takes place in. The kit comes with 2 basic sheets of instructions, some thick card pieces that are used for front door and window frames, and the roof, and of course the MDF building pieces. The MDF frames are a bit fragile and some parts will definitely come apart in your hands. Because of the way the assembly instructions are done though, that's not really a game changer, but we'll get to that. The MDF parts are mostly pretty easy to just push out of their frames. The only time I had to resort to using a knife was for particularly small, delicate pieces where I just didn't want to take the risk of them breaking. For assembly, I'm going to be using tacky glue. But I know that wood glue or construction glue are popular choices here. The reason I use tacky glue is because it grabs hold quickly, speeding up the assembly process. When it comes to assembling MDF though, one thing I have learned over the years is that you always dry fit everything first. It doesn't matter how small the piece or how sure you are that you have everything lined up well. Dry fit it. Every time. You're always sure you're correct, right up until you're not. So just take the mystery out of it and make it easy on yourself. It only takes a few extra seconds to guarantee that you're always putting it together the right way when you get the glue out. I tend to be pretty generous with the glue during assembly, probably more than I need to be, but glue is cheap and peace of mind is priceless, so that's an easy trade for me. Once this is done and painted, I don't want to have to come back and make repairs. The pieces assemble pretty easily, just slotting into one another. Sometimes there's an order to the assembly that works best that the instructions don't entirely make clear, but that's also solved by dry fitting first. It is a problem with the assembly instructions though, one of a few that we're going to get into. You may have already caught what the other problem is here. If you were taking a close look at the instructions and the other pieces as they flash by, you may have noticed that while there are numbers, or rather letters on here, there's no corresponding letters on the pieces. What those are is just steps to say, do this step, then this step, then this step, but none of the pieces themselves are lettered, and in fact, some of them aren't animated or drawn correctly on the paper. This one here just shows a few windows, when in fact it's doors that have to go there. That's a pretty big problem. Now, I would rake any company over the coals for not having clear instructions on how to put their kits together. That's a pretty big deal, especially with a kit this complicated. But there's another layer to this. When it comes to MDF, I actually used to work with these lasers that they use to burn this material. I've worked with MDF professionally, and I've also worked with plastics and metals and the software that's used to create these designs. So I know exactly how much work it would take to burn some letters into these pieces and change the instructions and make that a much more cohesive and easy to read diagram. And the answer is that it's almost no work. And it wouldn't add anything to production time either, a few seconds literally. These lasers move incredibly quickly, especially ones that are being used at this kind of high volume production level. So what's the excuse? Well, there isn't one. That's the problem. It's just a bad decision. It reeks of laziness. And while there are lots of benefits to using MDF kits, they're not the easiest to put together. The materials themselves can be somewhat fragile until they're glued in place, and having confusing instructions that you have to dry fit to make sure that everything works first, that makes it way worse.
But even with our deeply imperfect instructions, we can soldier on. I just double check everything before I proceed. Now, this isn't my first rodeo, but I do remember the first kit I put together, and it was a little intimidating. But I promise, you're all capable of doing it if you take your time. The door frames, window frames, and the roof tiles of the kit are basically just thick cardstock, which I don't love. It's pretty fragile, the roof especially, and it just doesn't look great. It will take a little work down the road to fix that if you want to. It's a process that I'll cover in my next video. On top of that, the card is just kind of a pain to work with. It feels like it's in constant danger of ripping if you're not using kid gloves. I would recommend using your knife for this part as a result. The door and window frames go on easily with the same glue we've been using for the building assembly. And when they're all in place, you're left with something like this. This particular kit also has 5 columns made of MDF. They're a bit tricky to assemble, and I did use my knife to get the pieces out, as these ones are pretty delicate. Luckily, the instructions are clear on this part, which almost makes it worse because it shows that they do have the capacity to write clear instructions. They're just choosing not to. But once you have the assembly process down, they actually make pretty convincing columns, considering it's made of flat MDF. I would still say, though, that this is by far the most time-consuming, least fun part of the process in this kit. With the first floor assembled, you just follow the exact same steps for the second floor and the balcony. Dry fit everything before you glue, affix the details like window and door frames, and then you glue the 2 floors together. As long as you're careful, the assembly process is pretty painless, and it can be fun and satisfying in its own right to see an interesting structure coming together as you build up the kit. When it comes to assemble the roof, it's basically just a bare bones support structure with some thick cardstock on top. I used my knife to score the card where I wanted it to bend, and then went right back to the tacky glue to get it glued into place. That does leave you with a roof that can come off if you want to be able to use the inside of the building. I don't personally do that, but it's a nice feature. You could similarly leave the 2 floors without gluing them together if you wanted to be able to access the lower floor in the same way. And once the roof is done, the kit is completely assembled.
Alright, so that about wraps it up for the build. Now, it was pretty easy, but it's not as good as it could be with just a little adjustment. It's something pretty much anyone could do. I mean, I'm not particularly good at doing them, but the key really is dry fitting everything before you use any glue. If you start gluing pieces, if you get ahead of yourself and then find out you're doing it wrong, it's a pretty big problem. So just dry fit it all first, make sure it works, and then move ahead. That said, it would be really easy to make these kits better. As I said, number them or letter them, whatever they want to do, on the sheets to make it clearer which parts they're talking about. Some of the instructions are pretty opaque and some of the pictures aren't drawn correctly. That makes the instructions a little bit difficult to follow, really more than it has to be. And I'm not just some hobbyist nerd pointing this out and dragging it and saying it would be easy to fix. I did this professionally. I know exactly how long it would take to fix this. And with the answer being not very long, it really baffles me that they leave it in this state. Now, when it comes to painting, I'm sure many of you have noticed, there's no texture on this, which means that a lot of the techniques that we rely on to paint large buildings like dry brushing and washes, they're not going to work well because those rely on texture. Now, you can fix this yourself. And I'm going to show you how to do that in another video. But it does bring up what's really at the heart of the difference between this and plastic kits, and that's time versus money. This, you have to fix it yourself. You're going to have to add textures before you paint it. It's going to take longer. And the build itself takes longer than it would with a plastic kit. But it's also about a third of the price of, say, the Games Workshop Laketown kit. And it's bigger, significantly bigger. So it all comes down to what you need. If you have a whole bunch of money that you want to spend on this, it might be easier to just grab some plastic kits and call it a day. They're going to be easier to build, they're going to have built-in textures, and they're going to paint up really easily and really well. But if you'd rather put in the time, this is, again, much cheaper. You get a lot more terrain for the price, and it's going to be way easier to fill a whole table with terrain using these kits. There is one other thing that you really need to take into consideration though, and that's design. When it comes to plastic kits, it takes a lot more work to make a plastic kit. So the options are more limited. Companies generally only put them out if it's something they think they can make a bank on. That is to say, you're going to find plastic kits for things like Age of Sigmar, Lord of the Rings. And yes, there are a few plastic kits and things for historical games, Viking Age or Wild West Saloons, that kind of thing. But there's a massive spike in the number of kits and designs available to you when you move to MDF. I mean, obviously this was a Roman house design, or Roman shops, but if you go to even just the Sarissa Precision website, they have all kinds of different scales, all kinds of different designs and time periods and kits available, and that's one website. If you want sci-fi terrain, you can get anything. You can get stuff that works for 40k, you can get half blocks for Judge Dredd, you can get anything you need for Infinity or Stargrave or anything else really easily, and in any scale you want. So personally, I liked this kit, I like MDF in general, but that's because I don't mind spending the time to fix it up, to make it look more impressive than it normally does. But if time is more of a premium for you, then you might want to go with plastic kits. They're going to be easier to make in the end. Alright, thanks for watching guys. I am going to paint this up and texture it in another video to show you how that's done, how we can fix the kit. But for now, please hit like if you enjoyed the video, and hit subscribe if you want to see more. There's always more content coming, and we do have some changes coming to the channel soon to help get you more content faster. So thank you for watching. I'll see you on the next one.